WSRE presents Food for Thought, in-depth discussions of political, social, scientific, and cultural topics. Tim Center is a vice president of the Collins Center, which published a report on the potential impacts of oil and gas explorations in the Gulf in February 2010. In December 2010, Mr. Center discussed the report in the context of the Deepwater Horizon disaster and explained how his organization provides objective reviews of public policy debates. Mr. Center's presentation was recorded at Northwest Florida State College and was made possible by a grant from the Florida Humanities Council.
So please welcome Tim Center.
Thanks, Ty.
Yep.
And good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to address you all and talk about something that might have fallen off the radar, but for some recent announcements by the President and Ken Salazar in the Department of Interior. But I hope to review with you today a report that many of you might have available to you. And if you don't, we have some extra copies up front here. Maybe afterwards you can come by and pick one up. Or if you're watching online or on the television, you can go to thecenturycommission.org and visit our website and download the report there, and also read a lot more about this very important issue. I've got the distinct pleasure of serving in a variety of capacities out of my office in Tallahassee, and one of those namely being the Executive Director of the Century Commission for Sustainable Florida. But my primary responsibility is that of working for the Collins Center for Public Policy. The Collins Center, and this is a bit of a history lesson for some folks who are not necessarily from here. I do always like to figure out who my audience is and where they're from. How many of you all are from Florida? Okay, good, a good healthy percentage. That's great. If you didn't raise your hand, it's okay. My wife is not from Florida, and I still love her. She's a great person. And if you're not from Florida, that's all right. You can do what we did, is create your own native Floridian. And think about that. But we've got a 5-year-old daughter, and she's doing great. And it's the reason I ask that, because we live in a state where 30% of the people in our community are actually from Florida. 70% are from somewhere else. And the greatest common denominator, therefore, is that I'm not from here. And that's why we're very honored to be able to carry on the legacy of what many consider to be probably one of Florida's greatest Floridians. Governor Leroy Collins. We're a think tank with muddy boots, if you will, at the Collins Center for Public Policy. We have main offices in Miami, and we have offices in St. Petersburg and Tallahassee, and soon to open one in Tampa as well. We are a group that is nonpartisan. We are independent. We are a nonprofit. And we work from a common place, which is how to make Florida a better place for all of our residents and for our visitors and for those who live here. And we do this by focusing on very important issues. We are doing a little bit of everything. And my focus is on sustainability, but back in 2000, when we had the election debacle in Florida with the Bush-Gore presidential election, we did the reform work for the state of Florida in a blue ribbon panel. We are engaged in economic development opportunities south of Lake Okeechobee, where U.S. sugar lands have been purchased, taking land off the tax rolls and helping that community now envision what their collective future will look like. We are engaged in South Florida and Overtown in Miami, working to regenerate a very troubled community. We are engaged in healthcare, justice issues, education. And one of the things we also do is we help out organizations like the Century Commission for Sustainable Florida. But we are named for Governor Leroy Collins. Governor Collins was the governor from 1956 to 61. He was a Democrat. He governed Florida during a very difficult time in our nation's history. Integration of Florida's public schools occurred during his tenure. The Turnpike system was created. The community college system, and the state college is here because of his work in creating a higher education priority for Florida, available to and accessible to all Floridians. And also created the University of South Florida. And in 1992 was named by the Florida legislature the Floridian of the Century, and Republican and Democratic governors alike have referred to him as Florida's greatest modern-day governor. And we're honored to carry on his legacy and doing the work that we do. And hopefully we have some time for some questions at the end, and I'll be glad to talk to you a little bit about everything, including some of the work we do with Sustainable Florida and the Century Commission. The Sustainable Florida organization, of which I've been the director of for about 5 years now, is a group that is an alliance of public and private groups talking about sustainability, which is not just in the environment. It is economic opportunity as much as it is environmental opportunity and social and building on our social opportunities as well. And so we work with big companies like Darden and Disney and Walmart and stuff like that, but we also work with education institutions around the state, colleges and universities, and we do an annual conference. It is because of the work that we did in sustainability and Sustainable Florida that we had the opportunity to, in 2005, begin working with the Center Commission for a Sustainable Florida. And the Center Commission was created because of, and you're pretty much watching it day to day now if you watch Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or whatever your channel of choice is, and you watch politicians deal with the issues of the day. They are not dealing with and do not have the privilege to really think long term. And the Florida legislature deemed it necessary to create a body, 15 members appointed by the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and the Governor, to envision our state on a 25 and 50-year planning horizons to help guide large policy decisions that would help sustain us going forward. Everything from conservation and land use to transportation to economic development and education. A very broad charge, but one that brought the Century Commission fully to bear on this issue of exploring the Gulf for oil and gas. And that's kind of how we've had the opportunity to kind of begin working on this project about this time last year. The Century Commission is staffed, it's a governmental body, but it's staffed by the Collins Center, and I have the opportunity to be the executive director of that, and we have a meeting actually coming up in Orlando on Monday. And we'll be talking about how we're delivering some of this information to the Florida legislature. So what you share with me today, I might be able to share with the Florida legislature and governor in the weeks to come. But interestingly enough, the Florida legislature in 2009 had actually had, in the closing days of the session, a bill that was proposed that would lift the ban in the Gulf in state waters to exploring for oil and gas. No committee bill had been filed, no hearing had been scheduled, and then all of a sudden, before the entire Florida House was this proposal laid in front of, and they voted it up. They said we should lift the ban, we should explore the ability to provide our own energy. This is the time that you probably remember folks in the national media were chanting "drill, baby, drill," and others were saying this will ruin the great state of Florida and other parts of our country as well. A great emotional debate was erupting, and the Senate chose not to take this piece of legislation up. And in fact, it was attached to the state's energy policy bill, which ended up failing for the second year in a row. Difficult times in Florida, emotional times for different sides that thought that this was the best way to go about such things. And so the Century Commission, the folks who are normally out of the day-to-day issues, chose to extend a hand to the Senate President, Jeff Atwater, and to see if there was something they could do, if they could offer up a non-biased piece of research that would be very accessible to all sides of the issue. If you took away all the emotion from it, you really get down to a set of simple questions. Where are the state waters? Where do they end? And where do the federal waters pick up? Who's really in charge of the Gulf of Mexico and the land that's under the water, the submerged lands of Florida? How does this process really work? I mean, we've all seen these oil derricks, but I mean, how do they get there? And what's really out there? And we had folks who said, you know, we're in an economic downturn and this is going to generate billions of dollars for our state coffers and it's going to create thousands of jobs. And other folks who said it's going to drive tourists away, people's real estate values will decline. And you had, again, two different emotional statements being made. Well, by offering a hand to the Senate President, he said, I would love to have this as a resource for the legislature to consider. And so for the period of time, with using an advisory panel that was made up of some environmental community representatives and some industry representatives, folks who are very close to the oil and gas industry, we were able to work with them in small round table over a couple meetings to make sure that we had the right questions that could be answered. And then, more importantly, once we had the answers to those questions that were independently put together by researchers on our team, one of them, Frank Alcott, Director of Policy Institute at Mote Marine Labs in Sarasota, and also a professor at New College, and now a consultant with the Collins Center for Public Policy, and also Tom Arthur, who's the Director of our information services for the Collins Center for Public Policy. They were able to draft some very objective answers to these questions, and then we floated it back to that advisory panel to make sure that we weren't saying anything that was value-laden. We weren't coming down on one side or the other, that we were very factual. And the great part is that we were able to do that. And that report came out right at the end of March and the beginning of April. We presented it to the Florida legislature, which at the time was going through a process of actually having public hearings on the House side, finally, on this issue, and to find out what are the facts behind all this to make folks a little bit more comfortable with the possibility of lifting the ban in state waters, which I'll address in just a sec. But the fun part about this was, not so fun really, was that during this debate, during this conversation, the Deepwater Horizon incident occurred. And that's not in state waters. That's not even in the Eastern Gulf. That's in the Central Gulf. And yet, it had such a dramatic impact as you watch the news daily to have that little window to the bottom of the sea floor to watch oil coming out at who knows what was the real rate. But it was scary to watch the oil on the surface. It was scary to watch the oil washing up in the marshes of New Orleans. It was scary to what could potentially really devastate our economy in Florida. Yet at the same time, this report was out there. And I tell you what, we were scared too, because we were really worried, did we say what we needed to say just in case something like that actually happened? And we did not change this report. What you see before you is what we prepared and we released to the legislature in April. And I think I'm going to go through it. I think you'll see why. The interesting thing was this, that during the lobbying on this issue, our report was carried around by Dave Mica with the Florida Petroleum Council and by Eric Draper from Florida Audubon. And they would walk into members' offices and say, see, we told you, and lay it down. So we felt we had done a pretty good job of sharing what the facts were, pro and con, and this is not designed to be anything but an opportunity to share with you some of the answers to those questions, and I hope you get a chance to take a look at that. So we're going to work through the various issues. I do want to mention that you can go online to offshoredrilling.centurycommission.org and take a look at not just this report, but also the input that we have since received from others who commented on the report and additional data as it relates to the Deepwater Horizon incident. Going forward, we felt that was very important to share that. So my slides are a little out of order here, but I share with you the 2009 session, our opportunity to work with Senate President Jeff Atwater, the question and answer. And basically what our report basically broke down in these really basic 4 areas: the regulatory framework, the issue of state and federal, the issue of resources, what's really out there, where are the economic opportunities, the issue of environmental risks that go along with the issue of how does permitting work, and also accident responses, what do you do should something occur, and then also the issue of aesthetics and opportunity costs, because there are a variety of people who actually use the Gulf of Mexico for a variety of reasons. I'll touch on that toward the end of the presentation. So our opportunity was really one that we didn't shy away from, but was also very helpful to take away the emotion from it, but also to draw the distinctions between the two sides, and especially in the area of helping out with estimates and identifying what was the reality of what could really become a revenue generator or a jobs creator for Florida. To start off with, the question is, where are state waters? Interestingly enough, this map of Florida tries to highlight this a little bit. On the East Coast side, on the Atlantic side, the state waters extend 3 geographic miles, 3 nautical miles. It's basically 3.5 land miles off the shore. So 3 miles offshore, and then you're into federal waters. And so you can understand why cruise ships, when they're going off the East Coast, they're only 3 miles and then the casinos open up. That's all you have to do. You have to go a little further out, though, when you're on the Gulf side. On the Gulf side, it's done a little differently. It's actually 9 nautical miles, or 10 statute miles. So it's basically 10 miles off the coast, then you get into federal waters. So Florida is responsible for the submerged lands out to 10 miles on the Gulf side as you go along the entire Gulf side. And so when we're talking about lifting the ban in Florida waters, which would then put the Florida governor and cabinet in the form of in their responsibility for issuing leases in the regulatory role that they play, and then DEP for regulating it going forward. This is the area that we're talking about. Interestingly enough, when you get into federal waters, and most of the time we're talking, a lot of times what proponents of either side would begin to do is talk more about federal waters than state waters. It's important to understand how the Gulf of Mexico is divided for federal purposes. We have the western planning area, central planning area, and eastern planning area. Of course, we're going to be in the eastern planning area of the Gulf of Mexico. The MMS, or Mineral Management Service out of the Department of Interior, has set these boundaries up. What I love about this, this illustration is really not so much really those planning areas, though, is to understand the topographical features of the ocean floor. If you take a look at Florida, you realize that this very light blue is more shallow. We are much shallower as a peninsula, and in fact, if you've ever been to Tallahassee to go to the State Museum, there is this wonderful discussion of rising sea levels, and it's been there since before this discussion of recent climate change. But it talks about how Florida was this incredible large landmass peninsula extending in the Gulf of Mexico and into the Atlantic, and you push this lever, and you watch as over tens of thousands of years, the water has come up to where we currently have as a peninsula. This very low-lying area, these shallow waters in the eastern planning area, really have a different feel than when you get into the deeper water in the central planning area, western planning areas, and you can see much deeper water, which would explain why we're dealing with such depths to extract oil from the ocean floor. But that's also has a lot to do with where the oil is. There is very little oil, we believed, or a lot of folks believed, in the eastern planning area because of basically the land mass is a lot different. And so it's just helpful to understand that. Now, in the eastern planning area, and I'll go to another slide here just for a second, it's interesting to know that, that there are a couple different issues at play in the eastern planning area. And the Gulf of Mexico's Energy Security Act of 2006, or the GOMESA, lays out some moratorium, or moratoria actually, on how you can explore the eastern Gulf. And in fact, the Congress said you can't do any type of exploration within 125 miles of the west coast of Florida, or 100 miles of the Panhandle on this one particular section. Let me see if I can do this laser thing correctly here. I don't want to blow anything up. So we're dealing 125 miles here. We're dealing with 100 miles here. And then you have, this is very interesting too, because this is a military demarcation line. And you're not supposed to be doing anything on this side at all because we have military operations taking place in the Gulf. And that is the moratorium that's in place to this day, and was the moratorium that was referred to by Ken Salazar, Secretary of Interior, yesterday, or day before yesterday, and the Obama administration, saying this is not going anywhere. Now, this moratorium was in place in great part because we had a ban along the state waters as well. If we had lifted this ban, the Congress would then feel a little bit freer to release the federal waters. This is an important distinction. The feds can do whatever they want. The state can do whatever it wants with respect to their own waters. But they do look for how the state treats its own waters, for how they're going to permit drilling here. More importantly is because we have this moratorium, we are also not permitted to share right now in any of the oil revenues that are generated from the Gulf, as other Gulf states are. If we're not going to permit drilling, then we shouldn't be a beneficiary of any type of drilling that takes place. And there is royalty sharing going on, and I'll talk about that in a second. So hopefully that's covered some of those basic questions. Who's in charge? Well, state's in charge of state waters. The feds are in charge of federal waters until it comes down to matters of national security, at which point, interestingly enough, the feds can come in and actually tell the state how to deal with its own waters. But that would be a very, very limited situation. State discretion on leases and royalty rates. Should we choose to, or should we have chosen to, let me do this, sorry. Should we have chosen to lift the ban here, we could say, here's how this works. You can rent this land for this much money. We can set the permitting processes. We can set the issue of how long leases would be for. We can set the bond requirements. Interestingly enough, on the bond requirements, there was at one point a potential Coastal Petroleum which owned the leases up until the 80s along the entire coast of Florida, was looking at doing something off of Panama City. And the state said, well, what we think is required is a bond of $80 million. And the Coastal said, no, there's no way it could be $80 million. And they went ahead and challenged it in court and actually won. The court at the time said, we cannot fathom how any disaster on the Gulf Coast could equal $80 million. And interestingly enough, I think that would be proven wrong if we look at the issues today. The federal share, the feds, of course, draw in 35% on current royalties are then shared with the states, the Gulf states, and then we would have a portion of that 35%. And local governments and federal in the GOMESA area, if any revenues generated there would be used specifically by Florida as regulated by federal law, would have to be used for coastal restoration, for hurricane preparedness. When you get out of GOMESA into the open Gulf, you're actually freed up and there are no real limitations on how revenue could be used. I'll get into revenue a little bit more in detail in a minute. But the local government share is an interesting one because counties, especially the Gulf Coast counties, were asking, well, if you're going to lift the ban, are we going to get some money? Are we going to get a portion of this because you're jeopardizing our economic livelihood? The answer is that you can set it up that way. It does not necessarily need to be that way. And of course, it would be up for the local governments to actually battle for their share of those dollars that they saw fit. That's kind of the role of the interplay between the federal and state regulation and the framework. Dealing with the issue of resources and benefits, we definitely have some interesting issues here because we had great claims that of millions and billions of barrels of oil and natural gas product off our shores. We had this great opportunity to create jobs, and we certainly need them given this incredible economic downturn that we've been experiencing and will continue for a couple more years. But this is all done really in the absence of really looking at what is out there and what kind of surveys had been done. Interestingly enough, for the state waters, the United States Geological Survey is responsible for state waters, and by looking to them for some guidance, we could then begin to really lay out some reasonable expectations, and that's crucial. We wanted to make sure that we weren't going one side or the other, but we were playing this straight down the middle, and I think we found some really good resources here to be able to take a look at how much is out there in the Gulf if we wanted to go get it. As it relates to oil and natural gas assessments, and we kind of lumping these together, we do break them out in the report, but for the purpose of the presentation, really just taking a look at that for 50 years in Florida, we had our state waters under lease. Coastal Petroleum had it. They had 22 test wells dug through 1983, all throughout the state. Waters. I can just show you there for a second. We have a number of different exploratory wells done in the Eastern Gulf. And really what we came up with, what they discovered was that there's really little evidence of recoverable product in the state waters. It's modest is what our researchers said, and it was agreed to by the folks who were on our advisory panel, about 236 million barrels or the equivalent of with natural gas. Most of its natural gas product is actually right off of the Destin Dome, and it trails into the Gulf up here. Now, MMS, the Minerals Management Service, is responsible for the federal estimates, conducting federal water assessments. And they had an interesting statistic here. In the Eastern Gulf, which is where we're situated, 7.71 billion barrels of oil are located under the ground in the Eastern Gulf. Now, that sounds like a lot, but in reality, it's less than a third of what Western Gulf has. It's less than 1/7 of the Central has. And I'll have a chart here for you in a second to kind of compare it. But here you kind of again see where some of the exploratory wells have been played out. When you get into it to compare our recoverable oil reserves in terms of billions of barrels. Again, this is federal, not state waters. But really, the Eastern Gulf pales as it relates to Central Gulf. And you can understand, all that goes on off the coast of New Orleans and Mississippi is because that's where the oil is. And that's where you're going to go. And we've got a lot of oil there. And natural gas, again, Eastern Gulf not looking very, very productive in comparison to the rest of the Gulf of Mexico. And so the recoverable natural gas equivalents are also not really lending much to you. So that's as it relates to product. But we also needed to begin to say, okay, well, based on the amount of product, and there is product out there, how much revenue could this generate? I mean, how many jobs could we get out of this? And that also raised some very interesting questions because some of the proposals that were coming up actually were saying they weren't going to have large oil derricks like those that you saw at the Deepwater Horizon site or the traditional oil rigs that you see. These were going to be very low on the surface, barge-like operations, not manned operations that tower stories above the surface and then, of course, extend miles beneath the surface. But these were going to be a totally unique new way of extraction and exploration. And so what we did was we, beginning with the government estimates, began to take a look at how do we put together the model for developing the resource base that we needed to come up with. And then using that model, we were then able to estimate the revenues that will go to government and the private sector in terms of jobs and the impacts that can be derived from the production profile. This is something that both sides were not necessarily walking people through. This report does in a very succinct manner, and hopefully I'll even do it more briefly than the report does. But using an international or ICF international study that we found to be very reasonable and approved by all of the folks on our advisory team, we found that they had some really good numbers. They had relied heavily upon those numbers that came out of U.S. Geological Survey and MMS. That was crucial and critical to us. The issue here is going to be as it relates to federal waters, and the issue is going to be relating to all of production that takes place within the Gulf of Mexico. This is not just as it relates to the Eastern Gulf. But as it relates to the taxes, the royalties, the leases, auctions, and the rents, the amount of revenue that we would generate initially would actually be negative. Because what would happen is that the opportunity to take tax credits for these capital outlays would be taken advantage of and take away basically all the revenue that was being generated. But by 2015, 5 years out, not too far, we would begin to see some revenue generated. By one estimate, $35 million by 2015. By another estimate, about $280 million, depending on where you were in terms of what the resource estimates were. The reason for the discrepancy is very important. One is to estimate based on what we think is out there is $35 million. Based on, and you all have stocks or you have a financial advisor, or if you've ever seen a commercial, it always says, previous performance does not predict future performance. The issue has been the estimates actually have been low. And the reality is that the production and the production ability by the petroleum industry has been far greater than what was initially predicted. So we have the ability to actually either generate more, extract more, whatever, and so that means more revenue. So if you were to use the alternative methodology on what reality has been, you got more closer to $280 million. And that extended to $3.9 billion by the year 2030. And those would be kind of annual revenues coming in for the taxes, royalties, all the different fees that are assessed to those companies that are going in and doing the work. This is what goes to the federal government, at which point you need to take a look at how the federal government then divvies up some of its revenue. Interestingly enough, after the Internal Revenue Service gets done with income tax collections, these taxes and royalties are actually the second largest financial income to the federal government. 35% of these dollars go to the states, to the Gulf states. So you're dealing with Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. So that 35% of which Florida is not part of right now, divvied up to those 4 states, to the 5th state, Florida, we would look to see that we would get about 10%, 10 to 25%, depending on how the negotiations were. I will tell you that this is not automatic. This debate, this conversation would have to take place in Washington, D.C. You'd have to have the Florida delegation working very hard against the Texas delegation, the two of the 3 largest states in the country right now, battling it out over the ability to let us have a fair share of that. But that could mean by 2030 that the Florida state coffers could be richer by $1.75 to $3.5 billion. If you were to fully get your full share of that money, we might get $3.5 billion annually. And by 2030, what's our budget going to look like? We have a $70 billion budget right now, $60 billion. It's been declining slowly the last couple of years. So you'd be looking at 5% of your budget could come from offshore oil from the federal waters, not from necessarily from the state waters. So that's kind of what the revenue would look like. So it's not necessarily all the amazing amount of money. I mean, $3.5 billion is a lot, but think about 20 years from now, is that really going to be that much, given the fact we talk about trillions right now? But what about jobs? Again, using the ICF International study and the survey, did a great job of really trying to highlight what those jobs would look like. This is not for Florida. Again, this is for the entire the federal area. And you'd initially look at the need to ramp up, to have new rigs put in place. With the rigs comes the issue of maintenance. So you've got folks out there working. You've got the ability to service those rigs. So you've got fleets going back and forth with food, with fuel. You've got the ability to take the fuel away from there, depending on if you do it with pipes or if you do it with ships. You've got the folks who actually work on site. You've got the folks who are going to be working back on shore to refine the product or to ship the product to a refinery. That was also an important issue, the question of if you did it in Florida waters, where does this product go? Do we bring it onto Florida shore and then begin to refine it here? Well, probably not. We'd probably take it to where the refineries are, and the refineries are really in Louisiana and Mississippi. And they would get the jobs. We would not really realize those jobs. So you can see that definitely there would be jobs created by getting into the Eastern Gulf. But here in Florida, at most 2,000 to 5,000 jobs at the end by 2030. This is not an incredible job producer, but it does create jobs. There were certainly some jobs there. Going along with this question, though, was, well, if we were lifting the ban in state waters and we were extracting some product in state waters and we were able to have our own oil and our own natural gas products, would this impact our energy prices? Would we see the price at the pump go down? Talk about energy independence. This is a very important issue. And the answer was, no, not really. The amount of oil and gas that we consume in our state and for energy purposes is quite large. This would be a drop in the bucket relatively. Every little bit helps, of course. It might be able to stave off us sending money elsewhere. But relatively speaking, no. Does it make us less energy dependent? Probably not, given the country's need for for energy. This does not do everything we need it to do. Every little bit helps, but it does not do something so dramatic as to permit us to say we are independent from foreign oil and those reserves. Could we put some limits on how we export this product? Could we say, yeah, sure, you can come in and take our oil and natural gas, but don't send it overseas, don't sell it to anybody else? And there possibly could be some. The Commerce Clause would have a lot to do with this, and that would have to be litigated. But in all, when it shakes out, probably not much. Not much out there, not much in terms of revenue, not much in terms of jobs, and really not much in terms of making us energy independent or the ability to reduce our fuel costs. So that's kind of one side of the issue of all the jobs and dollars it was going to create. But what about the environmental risks? And of course, we had folks who were saying this would be the worst thing in the world if we could imagine that happening. Well, there's been a lot of research on this issue. And what we were able to do was really do a lot of research by going through all the research that had been taking place and kind of sum it up. We summarized those findings. We were able to explain how the environmental permitting requirements can protect us a little bit and to prevent potential catastrophe from happening. And we also looked at the issue of responses to accidents as we've seen them. And so the report goes into that and into a series of questions that really, I think, lays it out plain and simple. Now, for a moment, what I want you to do is pretend you don't have any idea about the Deepwater Horizon incident. Because what I'm about to say holds up, even with the Deepwater Horizon incident. And we'll come back to the Deepwater just for a second. But relatively speaking, accidental spills are low probability events with the potential to cause significant damage. Think about the number of wells that we've got out there, the number of wellheads we've got that are capped. Interestingly enough, if you're in Texas, you hear always about this issue of if you go to South Padre Island and you go on the beaches, there are these tar balls that wash up on shore. It's not because of oil exploration, it's because of natural seepage. Interestingly enough, natural seepage has been going on for a long time. In fact, the Native American Indians used the oil that washed up on shore to waterproof their canoes and their water vessels. This has been something that's been part of life in North America and along the Gulf Coast for forever. The amount of natural seepage of oil naturally coming out of the ground and flowing into the Gulf annually equals the amount of oil that washed ashore in Alaska for the Exxon Valdez catastrophe, annually. So we've had this out here for a long time. Now, the issue is that most of the time, the oil that does accidentally spill from man-made issues does not come from drilling. It actually comes from shipping. And we've had some catastrophes in the Tampa Bay area when we had an issue where a barge actually collided with another vessel and leaked a lot of oil. And we kind of know what to do when those things happen. So natural seeps account for the highest proportion of oil in marine waters. Spills associated with drilling operations introduce the least amount of oil to marine waters. And the amount of oil that's spilled by the industry is really a small fraction of 1% of the amount potential. And so it's interestingly enough, just to know that, absent not knowing about the Deepwater Horizon incident, this is still holds true. And so while the environmental community could be up in arms going, this is going to kill everything within 100 yards of an oil well, the answer is no. The report goes into detail to talk about where we've closed wells, what's been the long-term impact, what happens when you're exploring for where you're going to tap a well. It might have some very temporary impact to the marine life, especially mammals, but relatively small. You have recreational fishing and commercial fishing that takes advantage of these oil derricks and wells that are out there. They're not three-eyed fish or anything like that, then you catch them. This is something that is seemingly, based on the research that's out there, not a harmful environmental issue. Now, going on to some additional environmental risks. Generally speaking, operational impacts are localized and short-lived. You do have some initial work to be done, but then nature takes its course and cleans the water. More interestingly, though, to note is this ongoing debate as to whether or not what is the true impact. And in fact, the NOAA administrator recently criticized Minimum Management Service, which now has gone through a complete revamping of how they're organized and how they work. But NOAA did come in, a group of scientists has said, we believe you're shortchanging the environmental equation a little bit. And we did point that out. And the reason we pointed that out was what was really critical in Florida, given the incredible ecosystems that we have, extending from the amazing crystal blue water, green water that you have here in the white sandy beaches to the mangroves in Central Florida. We have incredible ecological diversity that we would require and need to have a thorough environmental impact study done of Florida's coastline and collect that information before you could really understand what could be a potential impact to state waters. And of course, that was done. Right after the Deepwater Horizon incident occurred, we began doing a lot of tests to get base samples of what the water quality should be, what their beach quality should be, and that information is being kept in order for us to make claims against BP and other responsible parties. But the issue is that the environmental risks, as overblown as they could be by some on that side of the equation, we felt not much product out there, not much environmental risk, relatively speaking. But say that one line that we said, which was with the potential to cause significant damage if something did occur. And that's what we experienced. Significant damage that did occur. And not so much here, relatively speaking, as compared to New Orleans or Mississippi. We were very, very fortunate, very, very lucky. So then we got into some other questions regarding environmental risks and also the issue of other uses. And this was what made it kind of fun, which was, really, do we want to have a lot of oil and gas out there and barges going back and forth, or do we want to have a pipeline? And what happens to the military when they're doing bombing operations? Or what happens to recreational fishing when recreational fisherman, he comes out there? How close can you get to one of those things, or do you get shot at? What really happens? Or how about the commercial fishermen, and they've got these long lines out there and the nets and everything? Can it get tangled on something? Let me tell you who was really concerned, and that's this first one. The entire, and you might not have done much of it up here, but on the West Coast, they do it all the time. And this is beach renourishment projects to take and restore the beaches in Clearwater and St. Petersburg and Sarasota and down to Fort Myers. When there's issues regarding hurricanes that take the sand away, they need to renourish it. And there are only a couple places in the Gulf of Mexico that have the good sand that you extract and then you put back onto the beaches. Only a couple places. And Sarasota was really concerned about whether or not this was, what kind of impact this would have, Sarasota specifically. There was the issue also of how do you deal with the military, and the military came in and said we would have some issues, but we could work around those and we could work with whoever would be coming in. There's certainly the need to address commercial and recreational fishing, and I think there were a number of ways to work around that. But the first time, I think, in a statewide venue, this report tried to address what many folks in the environmental biological areas have been calling for, which is this issue of marine spatial planning. You're familiar with this probably in your neighborhood. You probably can't have right next door to you a drugstore, despite the fact that back in the day we had corner drugstores that you were close to when you could walk to. But now we've got all these zoning requirements. Well, we probably need the same for our Gulf waters. And in fact, this is taking place in other parts of the world right now as they talk about where can whaling take place, or where can commercial fishing take place, and for what seasons, so that you can have the population of stock replenish itself. So a lot of different competing issues here, and what we called for in the report was actually a marine spatial planning exercise that should take place. One of the other questions that came up, of course, frequently, which was what an unsightly mess this is going to be when we're enjoying the gorgeous beaches and the clean green water, and we're looking out, and there, 300 yards from shore, is this big, ugly monstrosity of an oil derrick. And the reality is you really can't see these things once you got into federal waters. We believed that federal waters was really where you were going to begin to see some type of exploration. And even those who were saying they wanted to explore in Florida waters were going to do something that was lower to the horizon than a large rig. And what you come down to is that this is not really going to be a big site soar as you might think it would be. The folks who were really concerned about that, of course, were the folks who had property on the coastline. And they didn't want to see that, nor did they want those who rented their properties to see that, and rightly so. But you could also look at Santa Barbara, you could look at Texas, you can see from offshore these rigs, and people continue to enjoy the beaches. People continue to enjoy the amenities that the coastal community can avail themselves to. Impacts to real estate values. Well, assuming you have no oil on your beach, probably none. But the reality is that there probably would be something, but we couldn't quantify it. And that was a difficult thing. Of course, we've seen property values throughout the state go down, whether you're on the coast or not. And it did not have anything to do with the oil issue. So we believe that there may or may not be. We did not have a very clear answer to that question. Impact of tourism was the other part. And you would assume that there would be some, but the ability to quantify that, by our answer, we were able to take this off the table. Don't use this as a club to beat one or the other up with. We would imagine that there would be some. With the Deepwater Horizon incident, though, we know that it would be dramatic in certain parts of our state. And it's not just to you and to the region in North Florida, Northwest Florida. It has been the issue in Sarasota, as I was talking to a realtor recently who had a German client looking to purchase land on their bay and was concerned about the oil washing up on shore in Sarasota Bay. The people that go, I don't want to go to Jacksonville Beach because I'm really worried about the oil washing up on the beach. Now, there's something to be said about Florida geography and the need to teach people throughout the world where the Gulf of Mexico is. But clearly, just knowing that there is a problem would have some type of impact. We saw that after 9/11 and the incidents thereafter, and how our tourism industry and travel, generally speaking, was decimated for several months. And we could expect probably some similar thing to occur, not because of the drilling, but because of an actual spill. Again, the actual spill being a very low probability event, but if it does occur, it's bad, as we've realized. And the key there is just simply this, when we got down to it, was how much of a risk taker are you when you're in the Florida legislature? And actually, talking to Senator Mike Herodopoulos, the new incoming president, he was quite clear. He said, you know, and he's a young guy, he's 39 or 40 or something like that. And he said, you know, my lifetime, never really any major catastrophe had ever happened on the Gulf Coast, so I would imagine that, and he was one of the proponents for this, so it seems like it would be natural that we've learned our lessons from other catastrophes around the world. We would be able to have an opportunity to explore in our own waters this economic and economic opportunity. But I was wrong, and he admitted he was wrong as soon as he saw the impact of Deepwater Horizon. And so that's what we believe would be a rational policymaker, a person who's able to take in all the facts that we're able to lay out to them and then work through those issues. Which is why we're at the conclusionary part of this presentation, which is to say that right now, I don't think you'll see legislation introduced in Florida for quite some time, despite the concerns expressed by Governor-elect Rick Scott that the Obama administration did not contact Florida prior to announcing a continuation of the ban in eastern Gulf of Mexico. We can still lift the ban in Florida, but I think that hindsight being 2020, having this still in our rearview mirror, if not through your windshield, is an incredible deterrent to filing any legislation that would go this way. There have been a couple task forces that have been put together. Both the governor and the Florida legislature and the House specifically have put together task forces to take a look at whether to put a constitutional ban into the Florida state constitution. That was, of course, rejected by the Florida legislature as proposed by Governor Crist. And the task forces are both looking at everything from economic recovery to environmental restoration for those parts of our state that were damaged directly by oil on shores and in our bays. The special session, of course, ended with, as soon as it started, with a declination of passing or putting before the voters a constitutional amendment. We also had the issue of no federal repeal of this of this issue just announced this week. When it comes down to it, I don't know if we had really anything to do with it. I think other external factors did. But we will share with you that the Senate President was very pleased with the report, in addition to some work that was done by Florida State University. And that information was shared directly with the Florida legislature. And the Florida legislature listened, and I think that they looked at the issues at hand. And then, in light of external factors, I mean, came down on the side of caution and chose not to choose this path of lifting the ban in Florida state waters. We felt that this was an opportunity to give policymakers, bridging the gap between science and policy, the information in a way that wasn't value-laden and clearly was very meaningful to them and timely. And we were able to do it in a very, very quick matter of time, basically 3 months. And so we were pleased to be able to be part of that. Century Commission is actually going to be issuing some recommendations directly to the governor and legislature as it relates to this topic in light of this report that the Collins Center prepared for the Century Commission. And that report will be out January 16th of next year. So that kind of completes my overview of the report that you have for you. Hopefully it was shorter than the time it takes you to actually read the report. And hopefully it was something that might make you ask a question or two. So with that, thank you. Are there any questions? Yes?
If Florida lifted the ban on drilling and they didn't drill anything because there isn't much there, let's say, could they still share in federal revenue?
The question was, if we did lift the ban on Florida waters, state submerged lands, and no drilling took place, would Florida be eligible to participate in revenue sharing of federal waters? And the answer is maybe. It would have to make a case for it at that point, that it was open for business, so to speak, but nobody was taking advantage of it, and it should be considered to be eligible. I think in light of Deepwater Horizon, which was a central planning area well that impacts the eastern coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, I think there's a stronger argument for why we would want to have some of those dollars in place in order to do things like Gulf restoration and habitat coastal protection. And there may be an opportunity there. There was the argument to some folks that this was merely not letting the nose of the camel under the tent. It was simply to actually lift the tent up to permit the feds to lift the ban in the eastern Gulf, which is really where they want to be, and then we would be able to get some revenue indirectly through that process. That there really was no intent, because for 20 years or 30 years, Coastal Petroleum actually had the leases and never really did anything. So the answer is it's of course just a guess, but I think we definitely would be eligible. We probably would get some. We have a strong we're about to probably become the third. We're very close to becoming the third largest state in the country. We'll pass New York, and at that point, the congressional legislative delegation has incredible amount of force to hopefully work through those issues. Yes, ma'am.
When would be the next time where our legislative delegation could be advocating for a bigger share of those revenues?
The question was when would it be the next time that the legislative delegation would be able to advocate for those revenues? The question would be not during this lame duck session right now, and by legislative leaders in this case we would be talking about the congressional leadership, and that would be well, the new members get sworn in, and then so you're looking at January, February, March, that sort of time frame. The Florida legislature goes back in session in March, first Tuesday of March, and we'll see what kind of conversation happens there. I don't believe, but my understanding of it is that there's not going to be any consideration. I don't think you'll even see legislation filed on this issue of opening up state water. With the moratorium, I don't think you'll see this conversation of revenue shares coming to Florida at all for quite some time. Yes, sir.
Right now we import. I'm trying to remember the numbers, about 65%, I would say, of the oil that we use in this country. And so let's say we opened it up. people who say drill, baby, drill, is this enough oil that's going to make any, you kind of mentioned this earlier, does it really make any impact on our national thirst for oil?
Yeah, the question was, you know, what impact would this really have in terms of our call for oil or fossil fuel independence or energy independence? Every little bit helps. And the issue right now, and on that front, is it's probably twofold. One is that we have really, literally billions of dollars going to people who hate us as a country. That is a concern, and any ability to diminish that would be helpful probably for removing their ability to act on that hate. The other part of it is just energy security itself. Should those countries, or should any foreign country, and we get most of our foreign oil actually from Canada, and which we've got great relationships with, but should any of those other countries choose just not to export to Florida, not Florida, but to the United States anymore, we are in a world of hurt. And so this is a security issue as much as it is anything else. And so offshore oil drilling in the Atlantic and Virginia, which is something where they're looking at right now, we have got a lot of not just offshore drilling opportunities, we have a lot of onshore drilling opportunities as well. And the argument is that every little bit helps as it relates to our ability to generate our own energy, which might buy us time to generate more alternative energy producing opportunities, wind, solar, tidal, hydro, and so forth. The interesting thing is in Florida, we actually have onshore oil rigs that are producing. Down in Naples area, there's a field there, and we've had this on for quite some time. Actually, the Collier family, Baron Collier, bought the land saying there's oil here. I know it. And eventually, right after he died, they discovered oil on the property. Very minor, but there's oil there. So, you know, it's not enough to take us off the natural grid, the world grid, if you will, of fossil fuels. But as India, as China need more and more fuel and energy, we're going to be in competition with them. Brazil is energy independent right now, but they are doing offshore oil drilling. In fact, they announced their energy independence on an offshore oil rig. So we do need to probably look at where oil is. And we continue to look at more and more places where we know oil is, but it's more expensive to get. Oil sands in Canada, deeper and deeper water is where we're going because that's where the oil is, because we've already extracted what we've got. But all of this is just buying time until hopefully we can move toward a more renewable energy portfolio that can give us a more sustained energy opportunity that's more that's more resilient than it is worrying about some of these current fossil fuel sources.